Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. This is the Truth Attack Hour, and yes, that's right, folks. We're back with the Truth Attack. Okay, let's just get right into this because we got a lot I'm going to try and get to today. We'll see. We are the Liberty Works Radio Network, and we do need the support of the members of the broadcast listening audience to keep the broadcast network operating. So, if you enjoy the information, the shows, the discussions, the lectures, the revelations, and the guests and the hosts on the other shows on the network, we sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over to the LibertyWorksRadioNetwork.com website if you're not already there listening online through the online listening link we have there. We sure would appreciate it if you could find your way over and get signed up as a monthly subscribing member. Every membership counts, and we do need the support of the audience to keep the broadcast network operating. There you go. So, and if you want to get more fully informed and properly educated and informed on the true nature and problems with the federal personal income tax, which is a complete and total fraud, and is being exposed more so every week because of the recent Supreme Court decision, well, then you find your way over to taxfreedom.com and start reading to get educated. If you know anyone that needs help answering IRS correspondence or answering the Department of Justice in court, including attorneys, you head over to irszoom.com, check out the site. You can call me, send me an email. I'll help you out. Doesn't matter what stage of the court proceedings you're in, civil or criminal. The courts are stuck. They have been lying to you for 50 years. The Supreme Court has exposed the lie, and now the courts don't want to deal with it. And that's what we're going to talk about today. What do you do with courts that openly, knowingly, intentionally violate the Constitution, violate your constitutional rights, violate the constitutional limits of power granted by the Constitution, violate the fact that they need to have subject matter jurisdiction specific to the claims being brought to the court by the plaintiff, i.e. the United States, as the DOJ, to enforce IRS taxation. So, how is this fraud been exposed? Well, since World War II, the federal government has been enforcing the tax as a non-apportioned direct tax without limitation. That is unavoidable and based on the fact that you earned money basically from any source possible to earn money from. Now, how did the government get the authority to tax everything that you do? Because the Constitution initially and originally said they can only tax by impost, that's foreign persons, foreign imports, and in foreign places, like territories and possessions in foreign countries under tax treaty. It says they can tax by duty, which is the taxation of exported goods, which we basically don't have. We don't punish our producers for selling successfully into foreign markets. That's why we have duty-free shops at the international airports. If you're leaving the country, after you've passed through security, you have a ticket to leave the country, the duty-free shop will sell you all the American goods you want tax-free, and you can take them overseas to either consume or resell. So imposts tax foreign imports, persons, activity, and places. Duties tax exports. Obviously, neither import nor duty can tax the labor of the American people conducted in the 50 states outside the territorial and legislative jurisdictions of the federal government. Right? So that leaves us with excise, the last category of federal taxation. And excise does reach into the 50 states. But in 1911, in Flint v. Stone Tracy, the Supreme Court ruled that the power to tax by excise is the power to tax the manufacture, consumption, and sale of commodities within the country, licenses to pursue certain occupations, and the corporate privilege. And the licenses that are taxed are not like the plumber's license, the electrician's license, the carpenter's license. These aren't like skill licenses. This is like a license to sell alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, the commodities and products the federal government is authorized to regulate by excise taxation. but not the labor of the American people. So impost tax foreign, duties tax export, excise tax commodities, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, licenses, and corporations. So where's the tax on labor? It doesn't exist. There was no tax on labor previous to the 16th Amendment, which has been used as the excuse to tax your labor directly, i.e. any source they want, unavoidably. You make money, you work for us, we own you, we can raise it to 100%, you're a slave, and there's nothing you can do about it. Oh, yeah, okay, we're giving you a break. It's only right now between 10 and 40%, not 100. They don't have the right to tax your labor. They don't have the right to tax any of your transactions, rent, interest, dividends, annuities. None of this is under federal jurisdiction. It's all under state law and state territory outside the jurisdictions of the federal government, which is why they need you to file a return to bring yourself under their jurisdiction by using their forms, which you have no legal requirement to file or give them, because you have a Fourth Amendment right to be secure in your person, papers, houses, and effects. And the law provides that if a return is required, then under Section 6020B, the IRS can prepare the return. And once subscribed, signed by the preparer in the IRS, that return becomes the assessment under 6201, which only allows the assessment of taxes, unpaid taxes payable by stamp, and taxes shown on a return. And that's why you want you to file, because they can't assess tax under 6201 if you don't give them the paperwork. And if you don't, and a return was required, they're the ones who have to file the return. So every single prosecution for failure to file throughout the history since World War II has been a fraud. It was the IRS that failed the requirement to file the return, not the American citizen that they tried to prosecute or did successfully prosecute and put in jail. It's all a fraud. At 6020B, if you want to look it up, they have to file the return. So the whole scheme is to get you to ignorantly put everything in your life down on one of their forms that says you owe them. And if you won't do it, they supposedly do it for you. But they don't, do they? They don't. They don't ever do a substitute for return. They just put a number in the computer and enforce it as though it were an assessment on a return. And they've been getting away with that fraud, because without a return and a signature on it, either from you or the IRS preparer, there's no legal cause to put a number in the computer as though a tax had been assessed, to allow the automated enforcement take over the fraudulent claim that you owe money because you worked. And they did not perform an assessment. That's another part of the lie. Why didn't they perform an assessment? Because there's no liability for tax. There's no liability in the name of the wage owner. That was made up under Chevron regulatory deference, where they allege liability under the regulations for Section 1, which imposes a tax not on any person, but taxable income. Who out there is named taxable income? That's where the tax is imposed. So how are you liable? Well, the fact of the matter is you're not liable, because it's not a direct tax. They made that fraud up under the 16th Amendment, because there's no power to tax your labor under Article 1, Section 8, impost, duty, excise. That doesn't reach labor. That's why I had to lie about the 16th Amendment. But in order for a court to enforce a claim based on an authority in the amendment, the plaintiff, arguing that there's the authority, has to show that Congress was constitutionally authorized to write the law they're asking the court to enforce. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that the 16th Amendment has no enabling enforcement clause in it. So that if the court claims, or if the plaintiff claims, that the 16th Amendment is the source of the power to tax directly, the first leg of subject matter jurisdiction, it cannot show the second leg of the requirement to establish subject matter jurisdiction, which is to show that Congress was constitutionally authorized to write the law authorized by the power granted in a different section. And we see this perfectly demonstrated in Article 1, Section 8, where the first 17 clauses grant powers to the Congress to exercise. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 being the power to tax by impost, duty, and excise uniformly. And the last clause, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, being the original necessary and proper enabling enforcement clause of Article 1 that provides the second leg of establishing subject matter jurisdiction, which is showing that Congress was constitutionally authorized to write law to enforce the power granted. So all of the powers of the original Constitution are enforced by the original enabling enforcement clause. And every amendment, both before and after the 16th Amendment, where it was intended by Congress to create a new power that would be enforced against the people, rather than would be administratively attended to by the way a vice president was chosen or a senator was elected. The internal stuff isn't going to be enforced against the people, so some of those amendments that do internal administration of the government don't have an enabling enforcement clause. But every single amendment where it was intended to create a new power, like the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, both before and after the 16th Amendment, they all do have an enabling enforcement clause, because that has to be able to be there. That enabling enforcement clause has to be there in order to go into court and claim that amendment is the source of my authority to ask the court to act in this case under the statute I'm bringing to the court. And that, of course, is the third leg of subject matter jurisdiction. A law has to be written to do what the power granted does. And we're missing the statute, because while the law imposes a tax on taxable income, it's the liability statute that actually establishes what's going on. And when you read the original Supreme Court decision and read the statutes, what we find is that the income tax is not paid by the worker as a direct tax. It's paid by a tax collector who withheld money as tax from payments made to a third-party person who had participated in some taxable activity from which tax had to be collected. You know, like buying alcohol at the store, or making payments to a non-resident alien individual under 1441 as a withholding agent. Because remember, the withholding agents were the only persons as parties authorized to withhold, deduct, and collect federal income tax only from foreigners, because it was a tariff act, an impost collected from foreigners from 1913 to 1942. The income tax was never imposed on the labor of the American people. That didn't occur. It was fraudulently claimed to be a direct tax after the victory tax expired in World War II, and everybody had gotten used to having their wages taxed directly during World War II. And of course, if you objected to that, what are you, a Nazi or a Jap sympathizer? And they put you in the concentration camp. So nobody objected. But the tax was collected from foreigners only to 1942. The victory tax took over, and for 43 and 44, tax was collected from the American people. It was an unconstitutional direct tax based on labor. It had no basis in impost, duty, or excise taxable activities or transactions, and they got away with it. And in 1945, they passed the current law, which authorizes the employer to deduct money as though tax were imposed from any employee who asks for it. And you ask for it on a W-4, where you should be claiming exempt instead of single and zero, or married and however many you have. 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 5. So the whole system is a complete and total fraud. And the Supreme Court has exposed it by ruling in 2024 that the income tax is not a direct tax under the 16th Amendment, but an indirect tax under Article 1. We'll be back in 5 minutes with more on this discussion. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Tell your friends, family, neighbors, and associates to tune in and get educated. Let's come down here. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network, and let's just get right back into this. I've set the stage showing that we had imposed as a tariff the Underwood-Simmons Tariff Act of October 3rd, 1913, that laid an income tax that was collected from foreign persons and foreign corporations working in the United States. It was not a direct tax, and it wasn't paid by Americans unless they misunderstood the law or earned money from within the territories or possessions, which included Alaska, Hawaii, and the Philippines at the time. So those were the folks paying tax, people earning money in the foreign jurisdictions subject to impost taxation by tariff. And in the United States, the tax only reached the non-resident aliens and foreign corporations under the jurisdiction of the federal government's power to tax and control foreign affairs in the United States through the naturalization process for individuals. And we see that because it's only the non-resident alien who's subject to the collection of the tax at the source by the withholding agent, i.e. the payor of funds to the non-resident alien. And there was an agricultural exemption, so it's outside the agricultural harvesting world. But once the non-resident alien becomes a legal resident alien, there's no authority in the statute to collect a tax from him, just like there's no authority to collect a tax from the citizen until 1945 and the Subtitle C employment tax law. But the difference is, in 1913, they said anyone who deals with a non-resident alien or for a corporation absolutely must deduct and withhold tax from payments made to those foreign persons. Have to do it, or you might be held liable for not collecting the tax properly. Tax is positively imposed. You have to collect it as a withholding agent from all foreign persons you do business with unless they're resident. And in 1945, they created a new class of tax collectors called the employer. But the employer isn't told, hey, there's a tax and you absolutely have to collect it. No, that's not what happens, is there? The employer, first day of work, hands you a form and says, do you want me to withhold tax? Give me your allowance certificate, your employee's withholding allowance certificate, your W-4. Why is your employer asking for your allowance, your permission? Because it's not an allowance like $1.50 a week for walking the dog and taking out the trash. This is allowances and your permission. It's right on the form. They don't call it the employee's withholding allowance certificate because somebody might say, hey, what am I allowing? Why do you need my permission? If there's a tax, you just collect it. Why are you asking me? Because there is no tax. The 1945 law, when the victory tax expired, they didn't impose a new tax. They just let you ask your employer to withhold tax as though there was a tax. But the victory tax expired, and you were never subject to taxation on your wages or salary because an hourly wage has no profit in it. It's an equal exchange of value for value. Don't believe me? Let's look it up. Here we are. Section 61, gross income. This is allegedly what you're taxed on. It says, except as otherwise, gross income means all income from whatever source derived. All of a sudden, the government can tax everything you do. Following items: compensation for services, including fees, commissions, fringe benefit, and similar items. Well, I don't see wages or salaries. Gross income derived from business, from dealings in property, interest, rent, royalties, dividends. Wages and salaries aren't here. Labor was never taxed under Section 61, and as we know, Section 61 is actually part of a Canadian tax treaty that expired in 1993. It actually has no basis as domestic law. That was judicial legislation. You just made it up, just like it was judicial legislation that made up the liability for tax under regulations and the regulatory deference that comes with Chevron. The only liability that exists in tax is at 1461, which is the liability of the collector, right? Here we go. Section 1461, every person required to deduct and withhold any tax under this chapter is hereby made liable for such tax. It's the only code section in Subtitle A, which is chapters 1 through 6, the body of law enacted in 1913 as the original income tax law, which the Supreme Court tells us in Bruchaber is a tax that is collected at the source by the withholding agent who is liable for the tax under 1461 that he collected from the foreign persons. And here we have 1441B, 1441A, collect tax from non-resident aliens. 1441B, the items of income referred to in subsection A, collected from the non-resident alien, are interests, just like section 61, dividends, rent, salaries. Oh, salaries, wait a minute. Salaries and wages are here. And so are compensations. Salaries, wages, compensations. You mean compensations are distinctly different from salaries and wages being listed in this statute as three separate distinct sources, two of which are missing from section 61, which only taxes compensation but not salaries and wages, because salaries and wages, hourly work, is a value for value exchange on an hourly basis. There's no profit in it. There's blood, sweat, and tears and experience exchanged for whatever hourly rate was negotiated and agreed to by both parties. Now, can a corporation earn compensation? Yeah, a corporation can earn compensation, but can a corporation earn salaries and wages? No, it can't. So when you tax compensation, are you actually intending to tax the labor of the American people by saying compensation includes salaries and wages, when in the statute it doesn't include them in one and does include them in the other? Aren't you supposed to treat each statute as it's written and not add words to it or omit words from it or apply it where it's not even domestic legislation? See, the labor of the American people was never taxed. Was never taxed. Was never taxed. You ask for it on the W-4, and then when you're young, you spend the first 6-7 years of your working life filing not to pay tax, but to get a refund because they took too much from you. And they knew you weren't going to have to pay any tax and that you'd only know a little bit. So how come they withheld 30% when you weren't going to owe more than 5 or 6? Why did they withhold 30%? to train you to file. Not to pay, but to get a refund. And then once you were trained, age 22, 23, 24 rolls around, all of a sudden the bottom line says, no refund this year, send us a check. And you've been trained to blindly do whatever comes out at the bottom of the return. So you spend the rest of your life slaving for the federal government instead of God, your family, or what you believe in. And the state forces you to literally exist as a peon because, as I said, there's no tax imposed on your labor. And despite the fact that the law, Title 26, Section 7809, requires every penny collected as tax to be deposited into the Treasury on a daily basis, which is modified by regulation to some cycle like weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, or quarterly. Most employers send their taxes in on a quarterly basis. Your employer tells you it's tax. He takes it from your check. On December 31st, he sends it in. On January 5th, the Treasury should have a record of all the tax you've paid. There's no need to file. You paid all the tax. The law, in fact, the same law that requires the deposit on a daily basis into the Treasury, also requires a certification to be made out showing the name, tax ID number, your Social Security number, and the amount of tax to be credited to that account as a result of the withholding and submission of the collected funds by the collector. So how come on January 10th there's no record at all of any tax having been paid by any American citizen in the country on a W-2? That is why you have to file, right? Because they tell you there's no record of any tax being paid. You have to pay. You have to file, or there's no record. How can there be no record of any tax when the law requires it, a record to be created in conjunction with the deposit of the collected tax by withholding? How can there be no record? Well, it's because there's no deposit. There's no deposit. Your employer sends it in faithfully, but somehow between the address or the digital account he sends it to doesn't end up in the Treasury, and there is no record because there was no tax imposed. And the fact that there's no record proves they know they're lying to you. They know it. That's why there's no record of any tax. They know it. They're purposefully diverting the funds away from the Treasury because they know there's no tax, or that what's being collected from you as a labor force isn't taxation. But what is it? Where's it going? What are they doing? They're not funding the government. There's no money in the Treasury. You know how there's no money in the Treasury? Because if there's a hurricane, an earthquake, or a flood, or some other kind of disaster, Congress runs down to the Treasury to try and draw out the funds that should have been accumulated through the tax collections and deposits each quarter. And what do they find? Oh, surprise! There's no money there! No taxes deposited! There's been no accumulation of revenues! They can't take what's there and use it for the emergency! There is nothing there! Where'd it all go? Where'd all that money that's supposed to be accumulating every quarter, being deposited in the Treasury, where'd it all go? Why isn't it in the Treasury? They told you it's tax! If it's not in the Treasury, Congress can't write appropriation bills and spend it. And isn't tax money that the government spends by Congress writing appropriation bills to spend it out of the Treasury? So if it's not in the Treasury, they can't spend it. So it's not supporting your government. What is it supporting? Where is it going? Where it's going is you can find out by looking at the back of the last check you sent to the IRS. If it was tax, and I'm wrong, you can turn over that check and read on the back, deposit to the U.S. Treasury. And that's what it says. I'm wrong. I'll pay you $1,000 if you can produce a check that says that. And I'll tell you what it says. It says pay to NEFRB. Because it never went to the Treasury. It wasn't deposited there as required by law. It went to the Federal Reserve Bank, FRB. A private corporation is cashing your tax check. Why? Why is a private corporation cashing your tax check? Because it's not tax. It's peonage debt service. You've been conscripted and subscripted by perversion, subversion, and fraud into servicing the $40 trillion borrowed from the Federal Reserve Bank by Congress through the unconstitutional monopoly on currency and credit that was given to them in 1913, the same year the income tax. They created the power to print money and the power to remove it from your wallet before you could spend it, so the government could spend the full value of the dollar before the printed, inflated, less valuable currency was spent by you as the second spender rather than the first, because the government spends it in place of you. So it's a peonage system. It's right out of the 11th century peonage plantation. We'll get in more into this when we're back in 5. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Tell your friends, get tuned in, get educated. Wake up, America. Wake up. Okay, this is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Let's just get back into this. We set the stage here by pointing out since the end of World War II, for the last 75 years, we've had an unconstitutional system of quote-unquote taxation that is entirely unconstitutional because it has been enforced as a direct tax, non-apportioned, without limitation, and which is unavoidable. You work, you earn money, you owe the tax. Not because you engaged in any specific activity or transaction subject to any impost, duty, or excise, but because the 16th Amendment supposedly enforced and created and enforced, without an enabling enforcement clause, magically, somehow, a whole new power to tax the American people without limitation because they labored in the 50 states where the federal government has no territorial or subject matter or legislative jurisdictions. No territorial jurisdiction, no legislative jurisdiction, and no subject matter outside of impost, duty, or excise. Foreign, import, export, commodities, licenses, corporations. That's what the federal government gets to tax under the Constitution. The 16th Amendment did not change a thing. But the Supreme Court, since the 1950s, allowed the tax to begin to be enforced directly, and since the 1980s, has allowed every single circuit court in the country to make up their own little cite to precedent, saying the 16th Amendment, it's indisputable, created a non-apportioned direct tax without limitation that everybody owes because they worked. It's all been a lie. Every single circuit court in the country's been lying to you for 50 years. Lying to you. And the Supreme Court has admitted it because 1 year ago, 2 years ago now, I guess, 2024, in the case of Moore et al. v. United States, 602 U.S. 572, 2024, the Supreme Court went over the constitutional authorities for taxation. And they declared, one, that income taxes are indirect taxes under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1. Impost, duty, excise. It's not a new power. It's not a fourth power. It's a mechanism to measure the amount of the impost, duty, or excise. But if there's no impost, duty, or excise taxation to measure, you don't just then tax everything the guy made as though it was a direct tax. That's unconstitutional. That's communism. In fact, it's the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, which is where graduated taxation comes from. Divide the population into classes, tax them differently with different laws for each class, not uniformly as required by the Constitution, and magically produce class warfare in the streets of every city in the country, and then just let the class warfare play out as you keep exaggerating the tax of one party and eliminating the tax of the other class. Class warfare, divide the people, make sure the population's representatives, the Congress, never represents the population, but only rules them. So the Supreme Court let the circuit courts all make up their own little version. Nobody would cite to the original Supreme Court decision, although all of the circuit court decisions said Brushaber said. But then instead of citing what Brushaber wrote, they made it up. They reversed what Brushaber said, where the court said it's an indirect tax collected at the source. And the courts perverted and subverted that into saying it's a direct tax without limitation on everything you do. They chose to enforce communism, not constitution. They chose to enforce unlimited powers rather than the limited powers they're granted. And 2 years ago, the Supreme Court said, no, income taxes are not direct taxes under the 16th Amendment. They're indirect taxes under Article 1. And they have to be uniform. Well, how the hell is graduated tax brackets uniform for citizens? You might be able to put the corporations and foreigners into different classes and tax them differently, but you can't do that to the citizens. Citizens have to be treated exactly the same under the law, and there's no direct taxation, and there's no taxation of the labor. without their allowance and permission. I'm sorry. What else did the court say in Moore? Oh, that's right. They said direct taxes, all direct taxes, without exception, do have to be apportioned. Just like they always have from the beginning, apportioned in proportion to the last census. Direct taxes have to be apportioned to the several states for payment. Well, wait a minute. The circuit courts and the Supreme Court's been allowing it, have been forcing a direct tax on individuals for 75 years. There's been no apportionment of the direct tax. It's an absolute, complete, and total fraud. It's theft by the IRS, the DOJ, and the federal judges of the circuit courts, and I'd say the Supreme Court of the last 75 years, excepting this court, who ruled on Moore, except now they won't apply their own decisions to domestic tax cases. The Supreme Court, the tax court, the circuit court, they don't want to apply the new law because, as I'm pointing out in this lecture, it exposes the fact that the judges are the ones who have been lying to you. Not the tax patriots and the tax protesters and the truth and taxation movement. Not the people they've been putting in jail. Tax protesters, frivolous. It turns out the frivolous argument was the correct argument. It's the government that's been putting people in jail with a frivolous argument for 60 years. It's the government that's conducted this criminal conspiracy to communize and rule and divide the people and ignite class warfare that will have both classes calling out to the government to intervene and end the class warfare they're engineering in order to usurp and steal political power, economic power, and your labor and fruits of labor, wages and salary, under the guise and pretense of taxable profit. It ain't in the law. It ain't in the Constitution. It's been 10,000% fraud by the socialist political movement that has infiltrated, perverted, and subverted the operation of the federal government and turned it into a ruling beast rather than a representative body. A ruling beast that steals and robs and lies to defend its existence, which has become more important than the individual, your life, your liberty, your freedom of speech, to be secure, to self-defense, to religion, to earn money, to work without federal interference or rule. Why do I say rule? Well, what are you going to do if they raise the tax rate to 100%? What are you going to do? They've got it at 20. You've given them the right to take 20 or 40. What are you going to do when they take 100? What are you going to do? Either you object when they say we're taking 1, or you will be ruled. You let the camel stick its foot in under the tent door, or its nose in through the screen, and before you know it, the camel's standing inside the tent, crapping all over the place, ruining life for everyone in the tent. And the camel is socialism, communism being the form they've adopted. The second plank, which is income tax. The fifth plank of the Communist Manifesto, which is the Federal Reserve Bank controlling through a monopoly on currency and credit the economy and the government. The 10th plank, Public schools run by the federal government, who determines that the curricula will be critical race theory, gender dysmorphia, feminism, Nazism, rather than reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, and an accurate knowledge of history. Which doesn't condemn Israel or the Jews. It condemns the Nazis and the others who would indiscriminately murder anyone who's different than themselves. That's what history condemns, is those that murder without cause, not in self-defense, but to eradicate. So the judges are the ones to blame. They've made it all up. They made up a direct tax under the 16th Amendment. They made up a tax on labor. They made up the unavoidability. They made up the claim you have to file a return. They made up that you're liable because of the tax imposed. They made up that you're subject to the collection by mandate. They made up that they can just order your employer to take it from you without a notice of levy, without any tax being due. Tax isn't due until next year on April 15th. How can anyone come along and tell your employer, deduct this from him without his allowance? Force him to service that future obligation, which may not exist in the future, but force him to service it anyway. Well, wait a minute. Doesn't the 13th Amendment prohibit both slavery and involuntary servitude? My money, the employment contract says you got to pay me. If I won't give you an allowance, you can't let the IRS say just steal it from him. There's no tax due till April 15th. I'll deal with it then when it's due. This whole system is fraud. From top to bottom, they've made up everything. And the judges have let them get away with it. And actually enforced it at the lower levels, and the Supreme Court has let the system go on for 75 years, and now they're too cowardly to apply their own decisions to domestic tax cases. They won't tell the lower courts, hey, you made a mistake, it's not a direct tax. They won't tell the lower courts, hey, you can't make up liability under regulations when it's not in the statute. And look, oh, hey, over here in this other statute, there is a liability. Let's enforce what's in the statute instead of what's in the imagination of some pig judge. Orwellian pig judge who took an oath to the Constitution, but is now serving an omnipotent state. Not justice, not law, not representative government, but ruling imposition and absolute control of everything every person does. No, it's not Orwellian, is it? I'm sorry, I'm getting off track, aren't I? And none of things that we've seen the last 6 years has been Orwellian. A demented president that couldn't talk, a vaccine that is a drug and doesn't work, a disease that was planned. Nah, none of it's Orwellian, right? COVID wasn't an exercise in psychological behavioral control based on biological weapons scare. See how much we can get away with. What can we get them to give up? Pretty clear, isn't it? Okay, I can hear the end of the show coming up. This is Thomas Freed on the Liberty Works Radio Network. Again, you can blame the judges. They're the ones who have betrayed the American people and thrown you under the bus. All the circuit court judges are guilty as hell. And this Supreme Court appears to be a bunch of cowards who won't apply their own rulings. We'll be back next week with more.